Welcome to this next installment of the video lecture series for Theology of Religions. We're here in Part 2A, and thanks for abiding by the fair use guidelines that cover this video content. Just as a reminder of where we've been and where we're going, in Part 1, I situated the Theology of Religions locus in the larger context of systematic theology by defining a few important terms as well as laying out the three tasks or dimensions that are central to this aspect of God talk. And I'll review those before we dive into Part 2. Here in this first part, 2A, I'm going to be focusing our attention on a little bit more vocabulary, and then in 2B, I'll incorporate some data about religious variety to help us attend further to Theology of Religion's three tasks. And in Part 3, if I get around to making the video lecture before the end of the class, I'll be highlighting some themes from Veli-Matti Karkkainen's book, An Introduction to the Theology of Religions. My goal will be to give us an ecumenically oriented framework for locating ourselves as Christians in Theology of Religions conversations. So let's get to that little bit of review. You'll recall that I described and defined Theology of Religions as our speech about 1. The theological meaning and value of other religions. 2. How we as Christians are good neighbors to people of other traditions. And 3rd, how we think about Christianity as one among the world's religions. Now this, I came to this threefold definition here of Theology of Religion's function or task in a larger framework of systematic theology by following the history that Karkkainen outlines in his book. The movement from Theology of Religion singular to Theology of Religions plural within a Christian perspective. When Theology of Religion conversations were taking place around religion singular, it was a primarily meta conversation about what is religion, looking for ways to interpret universal religious experience among humans. This approach studied the relationship between revelation and faith, faith and religion, and faith and salvation. If we were to depict it in visual terms, it might look something like this. Understanding that among humans there's a wide expanse of religious experience, what does it look like from a Christian-centered approach to thinking about faith, to understand what revelation is, what religious experience is, and how we think about what salvation is, or redemption, or reconciliation, or the release from struggle and pain that seems to encompass human experience. In other words, there was a kind of comparative approach going on here. How do other religious expressions, other religious traditions understand or account for things like revelation, faith, and salvation within their religious experience? But then as the conversation expanded from Theology of Religion to Theology of Religions, study took on different texture and content. One path of the Theology of Religions continued to focus on religion as a whole and understanding it as part of human culture, doing kind of broad sweeping comparative studies of religion. But then another approach is to become more particular, looking at the relationship between Christianity and other religions. So what's the relationship between Christianity and Judaism is one way to approach Theology of Religions. Within all of this, though, we are wanting to keep asking the question, how does Jesus make a difference? How does Jesus make a difference both in terms of the content of Christological doctrines and teachings, and how does Jesus make a difference in terms of our ethics and spirituality, and how we respond to people who are adherents to other traditions? You'll also recall in Part 1, I nuanced two important terms. On the one hand, we were looking at religion and faith. Now, of course, most of us strive to be Christians in a way that keeps these two things linked together. But for our purposes here, to better understand some of what's going on in Theology of Religion's conversations, we need to be willing to separate the two out and distinguish them at least a little bit. Here, I'm suggesting that one primary way to distinguish them is by understanding religion as a belief system that forms a basis of our worldview and has largely to do with external things. That is, how we interact with the world, how we express our belief system and our worldview through cultural practices, spiritual practices, ethics, and those things together forming our lifestyle as religious people. And then there is faith. Faith I'm describing as both the actual energy and feeling that animates a belief system and the substantive content of beliefs like doctrines and official teachings. So that faith is a way of describing the head stuff and the heart stuff that come together and express that and are contained and expressed through religion. So in this way, the pitcher and stream metaphors worked or analogies work together here. So you'll see why I'm inviting us to be able to distinguish the two in a moment. But I also want to signal that I'm going to attempt to use the term tradition rather than religion or faith. I might sometimes talk about a faith tradition or a religious tradition, but tradition is the word I'm wanting to use in this lecture series as a way of signifying the blending or the holding together of the religious and the faith aspect of what it means, for example, to be a Christian. So with that little bit of review under our belts, let's move now to dig a little bit deeper into theology of religions by looking at some more vocabulary. And here there are three concepts that I want to cover. How we think about the relationship of the term interfaith to interreligious, the mountains and paths, which is a paradigm for thinking about the range of options that face us as we respond to the increase of religious plurality in the world. And then finally, I want to offer a working definition of what dialogue is as we think about the function of and the importance of dialogue when it comes to interfaith and interreligious encounter. So first, to interfaith and interreligious. The big idea here is that context shapes usage. And I'm drawing some examples of how this plays out from a blog post written by Hans Gustafsson that appeared on the State of Formation blog, hosted by the Interreligious and Interfaith Studies Center at Boston University. And the title of the blog post is Interfaith is So 1970s. Part of what Gustafsson is reflecting on is how and why it is that interfaith tends to be the word most often used and that has most appeal to undergraduates he works with, who are curious about wanting to be in dialogue with people of other traditions. Now, the backdrop here is that for some people, the term interfaith means or is defined by conversation, especially in the context of interfaith dialogue, as the conversation among Jews, Christians, and Muslims. In fact, if you look up Wikipedia, on Wikipedia, the entry titled Interfaith Dialogue, what you'll see there are three levels of conversation. The first being ecumenical, that means conversation among adherents of the same religious tradition. And then, so like a conversation among Jews, a conversation among Christians, or a conversation among Muslims would be ecumenical. Then the next layer out is interfaith, Jews, Christians, and Muslims. Then interreligious signals the conversation that's taken to a broader table of people that would include Hindus, Buddhists, and so forth. But this is one of the reasons why for some, faith is also perceived as a Christian word, and that interfaith as a term tends to privilege Christians. On the flip side, or on the other end of the spectrum, we see that the term interreligious tends to be much more popular among scholars, and indeed, that's a term that Paul Knitter, for example, prefers to use. Interfaith, on the other hand, tends to be more popular among community organizations and houses of worship. The Interfaith Youth Corps, for example. It's probably more accurate to describe the scope and the range of the kind of people they seek to draw into their organization as interreligious, but instead they opt for the term interfaith. And I think that some of what Gustafson is describing in his analysis is part of the reason why. Of the two root terms, religion and faith, religion can be used more broadly and feel more friendly to non-theistic traditions. Here, when I'm talking about non-theistic traditions, you can think atheism, agnosticism, pantheism. These are traditions that don't hold beliefs in a supernatural deity or deities, so they don't talk about God or gods, but they do hold beliefs that form a worldview and a lifestyle. So in this sense, they can be described as religious. And because they wouldn't use the language of or the term faith to describe their belief systems. Now, Gustafson, as he continues his analysis, says that one problem the term interreligious often raises is that it can be perceived as only referring to interactions between and among organized and institutionalized high-level religious leaders. So you can think of interreligious panels at conferences, right? You have to be somebody who is professionally sanctioned to represent your tradition in these conversations. Interfaith, on the other hand, can sound less stuffy, more open, more relational, accessible, and spiritual, especially to undergraduates. Gustafson adds, and this is the part that I think is the most interesting, that because of this perceived difference between interreligious being more scholarly and professional and interfaith being more down to earth and ordinary, interfaith is often the preferred term among those who work on college campuses in the areas of student affairs and campus ministry divisions. Interfaith in these contexts might sound more intimate, more Bible study-ish, in that the term intimates a coming together to share personal stories of life, faith, struggle, and spiritual experience. The suggestion here is not that interfaith is a better term for this reason, but that it serves a different function than interreligious. So again, context shapes usage, but the other thing I hope you're taking away here is that interfaith and interreligious are not interchangeable words. That is, they are not synonyms. They don't mean the same thing. Even as they're trying to describe something that's similar, people from different traditions coming together for dialogue, and we'll get to what dialogue means, or coming together for service projects, or coming together to build community relationships, or coming together to get to know one another so that we can be good neighbors. Interfaith or interreligious, how would you describe it? Well, some of this has to do with how participants perceive the two words. So if you ever find yourself embarking upon inter-something projects, I would encourage you to be thoughtful and deliberate about what terminology you want to use for some of the reasons that Gustafson has outlined here. Let's turn now to look at the mountains and the paths. So this is a classic formulation of the options we have to respond to the marked increase of interaction among people of different traditions. Now, this language and these metaphors are, I'm offering them from a Christian perspective, okay? And they've been shaped by the thought and work of John Hick, Jacques Dupuy, and Paul Knitter, the three major influences on Christian thinking about this new reality and how and what some of the ingredients are that need to go into a Christian theology of religions. They've developed typologies that this metaphor describes. And I also picked them because, one, you can't have a conversation on this topic without referencing John Hick. Jacques Dupuy's work is the basis for Karkainen's organization of his book. And I also assigned some reading to you from Paul Knitter. So with that in mind, I want to also reiterate my little pesky theological question. As we think about these different options, how does Jesus make a difference? First, particularism or exclusivism. Now, exclusivism is the term that tends to pop up the most with this rubric, I guess you'd call it, or this first option. But I also want to signal that particularism is another name given to this this perspective, and exclusivism can be experienced as pejorative by people who adhere to this option. So know that, right? Know that particularism is a little bit more of a useful term if you are in a conversation with people who adhere to this perspective. This is the one mountain, one path. And what you see here is like the mountain represents human experience, and the path represents a way you try to chart from the base of the mountain to the summit representing enlightenment, ultimate reality, communion with God, salvation, reconciliation. You'll see here, of course, that there are 3 paths. 2 of them don't take us to the top of the mountain, 1 does. And this is what defines particularism or exclusivism. Dupuy refers to this as ecclesiocentrism, that is, salvation is found only in the Church of Jesus Christ. So that again, in terms of the metaphor, the path that leads from the base of the mountain up to the top is Christianity. Oops, pushing the wrong button. Knitter describes particularism and exclusivism as the replacement model. This is the understanding that, again, from a Christian's internal Christian self-understanding, that Christianity replaces other religions because it's based on revelation, that God came to earth in Jesus Christ and provides the means of salvation through Jesus Christ. We can't negotiate on that as Christians, so there's one way to salvation. The second option, or the second rubric, is inclusivism or type. This is one mountain with many paths leading to one path. What you see here are 2 paths that start off at different places from the central path, but they converge with the central path, which then leads all the way up to the top of the mountain. Dupuy describes this as Christocentrism, where Jesus is the source of salvation but doesn't require participation in Christian religion in order to make it to the top of the mountain. This is how Karl Rahner, or what Karl Rahner described as anonymous Christians, referring to people who were devout Jews or Hindus or Muslims or any other religion, who, as it turned out, they were following the tenets of their own faith, but their disposition as they kept those tenets was to, or also meant that they were following the basic commitments that one needs to uphold to be a good Christian. So that unbeknownst to these adherents to other traditions, they were actually living lives very comparable to those of Christians. Knitter describes this as the fulfillment model, in which Jesus fulfills other traditions, enabling people to then have access to the path that leads up to the summit of the mountain. Now, before we move here to the 2 forms of pluralism that show up in this conversation, I want to quickly identify or define universalism. This is the idea that in the end, God will provide a means of salvation to everyone so that there is no eternal damnation. This is distinct and different from pluralism. Pluralism is the idea that because religion is a human construction, no single tradition can be deemed normative. And so instead, what we do is we understand that all religions have something to offer, this common search for truth, higher awareness and self-consciousness, and communion with ultimate reality. Now, when it comes to universalism, Karl Rahner's inclusivism, or anonymous Christians, is one form or expression of universalism. It would also be possible to be a particularist or an exclusivist and hold to a belief in universalism, that even if a person is an adherent to a religion other than Christianity, in the final judgment, God may choose to save them. through the means of salvation provided in Jesus Christ, right? So universalism and pluralism are not the same thing. I want to deepen our understanding of pluralism by following Karkainen's lead and pointing out that there's both a negative and a positive side to pluralism. The negative side is that pluralism categorically rejects exclusivism and is often resistant to inclusivism. The positive side of pluralism is that it affirms that people can find salvation in various religions and in many ways. In other words, pluralism does not negate the need for salvation or reconciliation or to attain enlightenment of some kind. Rather, it continues to work within a framework of meaning that the way the world is not the way the world was created to be, and therefore we need the structure of religion and faith to help give our lives meaning and help us move from and help us experience the transformation we need to experience redemption, reconciliation, salvation, and so forth. So let's now take a look at the two then forms of pluralism described by the mountains and paths metaphors. First is convergent pluralism. This is one mountain with many paths. Knitter describes this as the mutuality model, and it's his preferred version of pluralism, where each religion, represented by each of the paths on the mountain, and they're going up the same mountain, offers something to help us all complete a picture of truth, right? This is another way of describing the little folk story of some people who were in a room that had no light, and there was this, they could each feel a part of something, and they were describing what they were feeling, thinking what they were in contact with was a depiction of the whole. As it turns out, they each had their hand on a different part of an elephant, and it wasn't until the light was turned on that they could all see that they were accurately describing the part of the elephant they were in contact with. It's just that what they were in contact with was not indicative of the whole. So the mutuality model kind of functions in this way, and this describes convergent pluralism. In contrast with convergent pluralism, there is divergent pluralism, many mountains, many paths. Here, each mountain represents not the combined human experience, but rather each mountain, or we might envision this as a range of mountains. Each mountain represents a religious tradition, okay, and that there are paths. Maybe there might be multiple paths, but there is at least one path up that mountain, and that the Jewish path is different than the Christian path, is different than the neo-pagan path, is different than the Shinto path. This is what Dupuy describes as theocentrism. There are many ways to know God. Christianity is just one of those ways. Now, what is happening here then in Dupuy's theocentrism is that while a Muslim may talk about God as Yahweh and a Christian might call God God, we each have our own set of doctrines, and we aren't trying to find harmonizing, bridge building ways between to bring them all together. We're allowing each tradition to stand in its own integrity, but there is a basic sense that all of these traditions are leading to God. So I might maybe a way to refine my little diagram here is to then point everybody to the same star. Knitter describes this as the acceptance model, and as you can see here, he's not a big fan of it because he describes divergent pluralism as a promotion of religious tolerance. It minimizes difference based on the faith components of religions by saying, okay, you've got your mountain, I've got my mountain, and everybody's headed up to the peak, right? But then there's a final option. This is referred to as post-pluralism. Many mountains, many paths, all leading to one reality. Dupuy describes this as reality centrism, that the center of religions is ultimate reality. It might look something like this. So you take the many mountains, many paths of divergent pluralism, and they all the higher up the mountain you get, the more the mountain fades away, and you realize that all of reality is oriented toward ultimate reality. Some of what this so that there's something. So like if I'm pointing at the screen as if you can see what I'm pointing to. So let's say that the middle mountain represents Christianity. So if I was a post-pluralist Christian, I'd say, okay, hey, I've got my path that I'm walking up my mountain, and I get to the top where I'm anticipating I will experience communion with the triune God. And as I get to the top of the mountain, I realize, oh, there's actually ultimate reality that is even beyond the triune God. This is what post-pluralism is describing, something that transcends each tradition having their own conception of what's at the top. Now, within this, or in addition to this, I want to offer Paul Nitter's Theology of Religions, just to give you a flavor of how one might go about putting some pieces together. There are two kind of primary dimensions to Nitter's Theology of Religions. First is openness, which is marked by confessional, canonic, sacramental or representative, and kingdom-centered values. And then there is the dimension of commitment, characterized by a Christocentrism, an understanding of Jesus as prophet, and a commitment to reconciliation. Let me go back and just say a brief word about each of these. The posture of openness is defined as confessional. We might think about this in intercultural competency and intercultural development terms as rather than the space of defense, my religion is better than your religion, of moving into a space where I know what my values and beliefs are. I want to share what I have and what I believe and what I value with you, not because I think it's better, but because I believe in sharing what I have and what I know. This involves a posture of kenosis, that is letting go of prejudices and assumptions about others' traditions and practices. A commitment to understanding God to be at work in the stance of openness, where grace helps reveal things to us rather than show us or orient us toward trying to fix problems. There is also then a stance of being kingdom-centered, rather than saying the kingdom is this object or it is this thing. We are orienting ourselves and others toward a reality of God breaking into the world that we know. Then the theological content comes in the form of the commitment, so that this openness maybe is akin to the external expression of religion, and the commitments constitute the animating faith of Nitter's Theology of Religions. So the commitments are threefold: to affirming, not marginalizing Jesus as the Christ, understanding Jesus' distinctive role as prophet with a preferential option for the poor, and then understanding Jesus' invitation and call to reconciliation as the culmination of Christian theology in dialogue with other traditions. In order to kind of have a fuller understanding of what is at stake by dialogue, I want to offer you this framework for thinking about what dialogue is. And I'm building on the work of Lisa Shirk and David Campt in their book, The Little Book of Dialogue for Difficult Subjects. They explain that dialogue is a process for talking about tension-filled topics, and it's useful for families, small groups, businesses, communities, organizations, as well as national and international conflicts. Ding, ding, ding. Dialogue is a communication process that aims to build relationships between people. This gets at some of the interfaith dynamic as they share common experiences, ideas, and information about a common concern. The common concern being, as religious people who live by sacred texts and who have hearts of compassion for others as inspired by our faith, we want there to be more peace in the world, for example. Dialogue also aims to help groups take in more information and perspectives than they previously had as they attempt to forge a new and broader understanding of a situation. In this case, we're talking about the new reality of the plurality of religions and religious expression that manifest in a variety and a multiplicity of traditions. So as you can see here, I've also tried to color code this working framework for thinking about dialogue, keying it to the 3 dimensions of Theology of Religion's task. To build relationships with people, that has something to do with being good neighbors, around a common concern, that is, all religions are concerned with quality of life on the planet, and how we think about what it is we have to offer as Christians to a conversation that includes people who are not simply or only or even Christians. So we have this working framework for what dialogue is, but I want to distinguish what dialogue is not. Dialogue focuses attention on listening for insights, truths, and agreements. It also is about broadening our understanding of an issue when we participate in a dialogue. Dialogue doesn't try to accomplish a specific task. Rather, it works at generating learning through collective understanding. Again, this doesn't involve a teacher or a facilitator transferring knowledge to workshop participants or students, but rather it's through a communal praxis that we are generating new understanding. This is in contrast to other forms of verbal interaction and communication that we use. There's conversation, which is a flow of information and ideas between people for self-expression. There's discussion, an exchange of information and ideas to accomplish or solve something. Training or education, that is about a transfer of knowledge from trainer to students or teacher to students. And a debate, where clearly there is a contest with winners and losers. These are not what dialogue is for. And conversation, discussion, training, and education and debate all have their place. It's just that when we are paying attention to theology of religions, the call is not to discussion, training, or education, debate, or conversation, but to dialogue. Now, in order to have dialogue, we need conversation, discussion, training, or education, and even sometimes we need debates. But again, if we think about what dialogue is focusing our attention on listening, broadening our understanding of an issue through this deep listening without trying to accomplish a specific task. And it's about communal praxis. So to close here, to close this part, I want to end with Paul Nitter's call to recognize that one of the ways we have, as Christians, we have to respond to how the world is to recognize it as an age of dialogue. He explains that the necessity of interreligious dialogue, or we might add interfaith dialogue, becomes all the more pressing when we consider and feel overwhelmed by the state of our world. There will be no peace among nations unless there is peace among religions. And there will be no peace among religions unless there is greater, more effective dialogue among them. I'll end here with with an invitation to consider Zoe Cohen's mural, Sacred Origins, that grew out of an interfaith project in Philadelphia. Creating artworks like this, murals like this, is one way to work at this interfaith dialogue, to sense what might be emerging, what communal wisdom about how we live together and how we are good and loving and compassionate neighbors toward one another in this complex world we live in. This lecture continues with part 2B.